Getting started, I got to know what's your initial reaction to this Supreme Court ruling?
Of course, this is something that was not unexpected. We have been talking about this and thinking about this for the last year, but I would be lying if I didn't say that nevertheless it wasn't still disappointing, especially, Chief Justice Roberts' comment about the fact that the universities with their race conscious admissions programs have been using race instead of using students' hardships and their skills and their life lessons to admit them to universities, when we know that students of color are often overlooked because of the color of their skin, despite their hardships and their accolades and accomplishments and lessons learned. And so it's completely ironic that that's the justification that he's giving for striking down race conscious admissions, when we know that students are going to continue to be penalized and continue to be held back in systems of discrimination and systemic oppression.
We did have three justices that were dissenting for the
Mhm.
decision. Did they give a reason why they dissented?
Well, I know that Justice Sotomayor is a very large proponent of race conscious admissions, and she herself has said that she is a product of that, coming from a lower income in the Bronx, getting to go to Ivy League school. We've had decisions from justices, and we've had court cases before, and they have always ruled that while, of course, race can't be the only factor, having a race conscious admission program in some way taking account students' backgrounds and the historical, socioeconomic factors that they've had to deal with on a race and ethnicity basis is okay in order to build a diverse class. And so I think what we're seeing is that, like I said, we've had this come time and time again. This is about the fourth or fifth case on this that we've had. And it's always been upheld in a limited fashion, but now we have a different court, and, they ruled differently. And I think that those three dissenting justices understand the implications, right? Because the Supreme Court, yes, they're ruling on the letter of the law. I'm a Harvard Law graduate myself. I appreciate and uphold the letter of the law and the rule of law, but we also have to understand the implications of the law and what that's going to mean in our society and what kind of society we want to build.
And speaking of implications, what implications or precedent does this ruling now set?
Well, the majority says it doesn't overrule the last case, but the concurrent opinion does basically say that the last case and last precedent is but all overruled. And so when we look forward, schools are going to have to think about creating race neutral ways in order to build a diverse class, perhaps looking at socioeconomics, looking at first generation status, family wealth. But the thing that's important is this is not just going to affect universities, right? This is also going to affect K-12 admissions. This is going to affect diverse hiring practices and employment, right? These same challenges can be brought in other areas. All of these ways that we have been trying to even out the playing field, bring equity for students and adults and people of color in this country, an increasingly large percentage of this country, we're going to start to see challenges in various different areas.
So to clarify, because this is a conversation we were having in our newsroom before we contacted you, would this precedent be strictly for college admissions, or as you said, that it can go through K through 12 and other areas of the workforce? Can we talk about that a little bit if you don't mind?
Absolutely. So the two cases, is University of North Carolina and it's Harvard University. Both of those are higher education institutions. And so the most immediate effect, of course, is in higher ed. But K-12, we look at secondary school selective admissions there. They are subject to the same rulings and will have to make race neutral policies. Now, they could choose not to, but they'll likely be sued, and it, likely will have to make race neutral policies for that. When we look at the workforce, I think people are going to need to be cautious. No one wants to open themselves up to a lawsuit. And this is what I said, it's the difference between just the letter of the law, what the opinion says, and the implications in society. People do not like to get sued. It is very expensive. People do not want to be the named plaintiff or named defendant in a case, right? And so we're going to see a okay, what can I do? What is likely to be challenged? How do I not open myself up to risk into scrutiny?
Now, I also want to go into your story a little bit, being a graduate from Princeton and then Harvard. Having attending two Ivy Leagues, how important is race conscious admissions? Having going through both of those institutions yourself, could you see a benefit to this? And would this have an adverse effect to future generations of people of color in those institutions?
Absolutely. And so for my background, my parents were both in the military, both of them that received their degrees only after joining the military. My mom is a Jamaican immigrant. And so they didn't really understand a lot about higher education, but knew education was important. And when you think about the different advantages that come even from just knowledge gap, I think people are often so focused on, oh, okay, financial benefits. But if you look at Black wealth and Black generational higher education attainment in this country, there isn't a cultural knowledge base of how to go through and navigate systems of higher education. And I had to do a lot of that on my own. But when you have, and I don't think I just got into Princeton because of my race. I don't think I got into Harvard Law School because of my race. But I will say that the things that I was able to accomplish despite growing up in a lower income family, despite not necessarily having those institutional knowledge in my family about how to navigate these spaces, were taken into consideration. And I think that's important. When we look at things like graduate school admissions, we specialize in working with Black and Brown students and first generation students in the law school application process at Barrier Breakers. And, Black students and Latina students, they tend to score about 10 points lower on average on the law school admission test than their white counterparts. And that's not because they're not as smart or not as gifted, but it's because of the types of schooling that happens. There's a lot of segregation that comes with students that can go to fancy elite private schools for elementary school versus, that public school that might be underfunded in terms of reading comprehension. We've seen studies on the science of reading and which students are getting left behind in that. And so when you get to those standardized tests that test reading comprehension, that test logic, that test critical reasoning, some students just have an advantage because of their educational background as early as preschool. And so you need to take that into consideration when you're doing admissions, because otherwise you are holding everyone to the same standard when you know that because of race, because of ethnicity and background, not everyone actually had the same starting point.
When people look at this later on tonight, what do you want them to take away from this decision in general?
So I think, if you're out there, your family, maybe you've got a high schooler and you're like, okay, what does this mean for my kid? What does this mean for our family? I want first off students to not get discouraged. We do see, and we have seen in California and in Michigan, when these race conscious policies are struck down, there usually is a drop in enrollment pretty significantly in Black and Latinx and Black and Brown communities. But some of that comes from discouragement. And so I would encourage students and families not to get discouraged. Apply to the schools anyways. Tell your story anyways. In your essays, in the places where you can show who you are, make sure they understand what you have not just overcome but achieved. Make sure they understand the beauty of your culture and your background, the values that you learn from it, and continue to advocate for yourself in those spaces. There's work to be done, and now ever more than there was before. And so I'd also encourage those, maybe you don't have a kid, maybe you're just in your mid-50s and you're watching this happening, support organizations that are supporting higher education access. Find local nonprofits, find college access organizations, ask them how they can need support. Support your local HBCUs, your historically Black colleges and universities, because they are also doing the work to prepare students to be even better so that they can navigate the different systems that they need to, given race conscious policies not being able to be taken into account anymore.
Some are calling this decision a negative impact for affirmative action, but you've been saying a different term. Can you explain that term to us for race conscious admissions
Right.
versus?
I think absolutely. So affirmative action is just an easier term to say. It's what people are more used to hearing. But I want to be specific in saying race conscious admissions, because I think when people hear the term affirmative action, they're just thinking, oh, we're benefiting one group over other groups, or this group is getting something that maybe they didn't deserve, or they're just getting an extra thing because they're Black, because they're Latinx, because they're Native American. It's affirmative action. It's the thought that you are affirmatively helping, right? And I'm not saying that that's not necessarily what's happening, but I think it's really important to know that this ruling is not about that. This ruling is more specific, it's more nuanced where we're at, because affirmative action has actually been it's been limited over the years. When the policy first came out, when affirmative action first came out over 20 years ago, it was a different policy. And because we've had several different court cases, it's really gotten limited to, can you have a policy that is conscious, that takes into an account an applicant's race as part of several factors? That's what affirmative action has been whittled down to today, right? And that's important to know, that we are really talking about a narrow, narrow set of policies right now. And that's what has gone away. The ability for schools to even take into account an applicant's race as part of a set of many holistic factors. That is why I've been saying race conscious admission, the ability to be conscious of an applicant's race as part of many factors.